Hello learners, and welcome to the 47th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century women's novel, which we are tracking through the work of a selected group of 12 women novelists. I have been tracking a couple of themes. I focused maybe a little bit too much on the early days of the railroad in the Pacific Northwest, and I've tried to build some cultural resonance for the novel Housekeeping by referring to two more recent contemporary American narratives. I'll continue for a few minutes longer in that vein before shifting gears to a theoretical conversation and returning to read some more paragraphs from the novel. This is a particularly rich set of explorations, or at least the way the novel is written, it invites a particularly rich set of reflections. It is almost as rich as some of the theoretical thinking. And a word that I'll use a little bit is dialectical. Dialectical is a word that comes from a lot of German 19th century philosophy and was established in the 20th century as the key mode of thinking that characterizes Marxist thought. However, a lot of 21st century American literary criticism, especially characterized and inaugurated by the work of Bill Brown in his book Thing Theory, but several others have established a way of thinking about realism and description of material things, and especially the kind of domestic realism we find in Marilynne Robinson's novel Housekeeping, which can also be very accurately described with the word dialectical. So what is this dialectics? I'll reflect a little bit on that. But before that, I want to return to two other cultural narratives, one very short and one roughly book length, both of which were published around the same time as Robinson's novel Housekeeping. The first is an unlikely source, and actually wasn't planning to discuss it, but it struck me this very morning as I was preparing and driving up here. This is the poem One Art by Elizabeth Bishop, which was published first in the New Yorker magazine in the year 1976. I'll read this poem first and then make a few comments about how this helps inaugurate a very specific kind of dialectical thinking, which will be developed much more robustly in Housekeeping. So this is One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day, accept the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster, places and names, and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last, or next to last, of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster, some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love, I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing is not too hard to master, though it may look like disaster. So this is a very famous poem. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. And in fact, the interpretive claims that I will make, or at least the intellectual work that I will be recruiting this poem to perform in our discussion of Housekeeping is a little bit different from the way this poem has been read. Traditionally, this poem has been read as an engagement with and a way of reconciling with a loss. And most scholars agree that this poem was written in the immediate aftermath of the poet's partner taking their life by suicide. And this happened in Brazil, after which the poet moved. And so the reference to losing a city is a reference to losing Sao Paulo. I will not be focusing on grief and loss so much as the first 3 lines, the first stanza, in fact. And even more specifically, the second line of the poem, which goes, so many things seem filled with the intent to be lost, that their loss is no disaster. Now, the poet here begins this proposition in which she's trying to convince the reader that grief and loss may overwhelm us, and we may be very convinced that we are immersed or even trapped in these experiences, in these circumstances which are not of our making, but which we cannot unmake. And so the experience of grief is a disabling and disempowering experience. And this poem is a way of redescribing that experience of disability and disempowerment as, in fact, an experience with the potential to empower and not to disempower. So, in that sense, it's a very typical treatment of a very old theme, and it is in the tradition of the 20th century elegy. Now, the thing that I want to note is that the first reason and evidence that the poet gives in order to restate or reinterpret this very familiar experience of grief is a comment on the materiality of things. And that line, as I read out, is so many things seem filled with the intent to be lost, that their loss is no disaster. This thought, I want to stay on this thought for a minute and clarify it. Losing something should not overwhelm us with grief because it was already scripted or built into the ontology or the construction or the materiality of those things that they would be lost. So the fact that something is lost may feel like an exceptional or tragic event, but if one changes one's perspective, shifts one's gaze a little bit, and looks at the thing itself which was lost in a new way, in a materialistic way, or the way that this poem is trying to teach its readers to take, then from that perspective, the loss does not appear to be a tragedy, but a very logical end to a process which was leading up to it, and a process which will continue beyond this loss. This idea is remarkably resonant, and it actually travels a lot, and it's almost surprising to find it repeated in different forms, in different texts around the same time. So, in the year 1982, 6 years after this poem was published, and 2 years after Housekeeping was published, the British sociologist and Marxist scholar Marshall Berman published this book, All That Is Solid Melts into Air, The Experience of Modernity. Now, Marshall Berman performs a sort of British and Anglophone theoretical reconstruction of a series of ideas that had been very popular in the German intellectual tradition for a few decades before. So, in a way, it's a translation, it's a process of anglicizing ideas that were very common in the German intellectual tradition. And what is that idea? It is the dialectical idea that, going back to Marx, and this phrase is actually from the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx, and the whole phrase is, all that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is soon to be profaned. There are versions of this idea that can be found in early 20th, mid 20th, late 20th, but I don't think there are any versions of this in the 21st century. Throughout the work of the Frankfurt School, as well as other German sociologists and scholars, this Marxian idea is repeated. I had quoted a version of this in an earlier lecture, which is Walter Benjamin's sentence that every document of civilization is a document of barbarism. Now, to return a little bit to the Communist Manifesto and what Marshall Berman makes of this, Marshall Berman makes a lot of Marx's claim that the bourgeoisie, which appeared in the 19th century to be symbolizing things like stability, security, and middle class ascendancy, was in fact an extremely revolutionary class. In fact, Marx claims in the Communist Manifesto that the bourgeoisie is, in fact, the most revolutionary class to have ever existed in the history of the evolution of classes. So, this is a dramatic and somewhat revolutionary claim because the class that is conventionally associated with revolution is the working class. And this is also famous in other documents by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, in which they call on the workers of the world to unite because they have nothing to lose but their chains, and so on and so forth. So these kinds of claims are more familiar to us, but the claim that the bourgeoisie is a revolutionary class, this I take to be the paradigmatic statement exemplifying the meanings of dialectical thinking. So why does Marx claim that the bourgeoisie is the most revolutionary class to have ever existed? Marx claims this because for Marx, the destruction of the feudal order, the creation of the capitalistic order, is a revolutionary task because it involves rejecting many traditionally held assumptions. Assumptions like the value of commodities, whether it was food or whether it was other household necessities, was given to the producer by a source who could not be questioned. This source could be God, this source could be the king, this source could also be the church, but the baseline assumption was that values are fixed. Values are not determined by the push and pull, by the negotiation of the market. This tendency or the certainty later that values of commodities have nothing to do with what it takes to produce the commodity, but rather the value is determined by how much someone else is willing to pay for it. The establishment of the certainty of the market in determining the value of a commodity, this in essence is what the bourgeoisie helps establish. Now, for Marx, if the bourgeoisie really wants to continue enjoying the success that it does enjoy, then it must realize that it cannot stop at simply destroying the feudal order. The bourgeoisie must continue to destroy and remake every social order in succession in order to keep demonstrating that value is determined through demand and supply. This is, in essence, the heart of dialectical thinking. Dialectical thinking takes many forms. One form is this, that the materiality of the object means nothing if it cannot be converted into an immaterial significance of value. So things that are produced in factories, they are all very real. They are made of raw materials which are heavy and it takes time, effort. It's difficult because it is hard to produce commodities. And it is difficult because commodities are material things. This is only half the story of capitalism, of modernity. The other half of the story is that no matter how real the commodity is, it is sustainable, or the production of that reality is sustainable only if it can be very easily and very quickly converted into something unreal, something immaterial, something almost spiritual. Now, what are these things? What are these immaterial and spiritual things into which objects need to be converted? They go by different names, but one very frequent definition of this value into which material objects must be converted is their financial or monetary or fiscal value. If an object is not valued in the market as being of greater value than other objects, then immediately the production of that object is under threat. This is one way in which Marx defines the commodity as at the same time real and spectral. And this discussion of the commodity is in a chapter titled The Commodity Fetishism, and it's in volume 1 of Capital. So there are many instances in Marx as well as 20th century interpreters of Marxist thought which offer us this dialectical thought, which is things are real, but in order for things to continue to be real, they must be converted into something that is unreal. And this is a very precarious state for all businesses, for all capitalist enterprises to exist. And this is what Marshall Berman means when he calls modernity itself, or the experience of modernity itself, as being this kind of a strange and confusing experience in which everything that is solid must melt into air. And Marshall Berman connects this to his own experience of living in Bronx, which is a borough of New York City, and describing the precarious housing situation. It's no secret that New York City is home to the most vulnerable housing situation in the world. But then again, that claim also comes with certain qualifiers if housing is defined in a particular way. But nonetheless, in a certain American centric or Eurocentric perspective, housing in New York City is seen as dangerous and vulnerable because there's a fundamental contradiction between the materiality of housing, that is, what a human being needs, and the cost of building a house, the cost of paying individuals to labor while building the house, the cost of materials that will be used to build the house, and most importantly, the cost of land on which the house will be built. These are all real material things, they're not negotiable. But one thing in that, the cost of land, that is less material, and or at least it is partly material and more than partly subject to negotiation and subject to speculation, subject to conversations about what will be the value of that in the near future or even in the far off future. This tells Marshall Berman that we cannot escape this dialectical and precarious world, and that we're all living in a world in which things that are solid will soon melt into air, and we can never be certain about the value of anything, in fact. Now, somewhat scary vision, but intellectually speaking, or at least formally speaking, the key rhetorical move in Marshall Berman's book is this dialectical thinking. Now, I'll return to Housekeeping now, which is published roughly around the same time as these two accounts. And Housekeeping is a haunting book. It's haunting because it presents multiple perspectives on the disappearance of things, but also the disappearance and invisibility, and sometimes even the deliberate invisibilization of both actions as well as things. So, the action that is frequently invisibilized is labor, specifically women's labor. And this is something that connects the novel to first wave feminism. I mentioned Simone de Beauvoir's work, but I'll refer to some other texts as well. Most importantly, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, the precursor to which incidentally appeared in the magazine Good Housekeeping. And so the title of Robinson's novel Housekeeping is not incidental. It is coming from a place of deep engagement with the ethics and the aesthetics of how and why the task and the labor of keeping a house has been frequently assigned to women, but also, and that's not the full story, why and how have many women themselves taken up, engaged with, accepted, rejected, and most importantly, developed an emotional stance in which it is neither an acceptance or neither a full acceptance nor a full rejection, or at least a permanent rejection of this duty and labor of housekeeping, but something that frequently shuttles between these two extremes. So, what are these two extremes? Accepting devoutly, dutifully, the labor of maintaining a house by a woman, that is one extreme. The other extreme would be to reject completely the labor of keeping a house. The point that the novel Housekeeping makes is that neither of these two extremes are realistic or sustainable, but rather it invites us and teaches us and educates us in developing the emotional wherewithal to accept and understand that a woman, or specifically two women, that is Ruth and Sylvie, would develop a perspective in which they would do both, that is, both accept and reject the labor of housekeeping, but also sometimes do neither, and sometimes be completely outside this very frame, this very conversation, or this very horizon of thought that the task of keeping a house should be even mentioned or thought of in the same sentence, or being in some ways connected to the life of a woman. So, between these two extremes, the novel teaches us to inhabit a dialectical perspective. Dialectical because for a lot of women, the labor of housekeeping in the novel Housekeeping is a real burden and a real pressure. But for a lot of women, at least not a lot, but definitely these two women, Ruth and Sylvie, at one point, they decide to quite literally burn the house down and leave. This does not mean, however, that they refuse to keep house, but rather they argue for a new way of thinking, of inhabiting this relationship with housekeeping. So, enough theory. Let me read from the early pages of the novel. This is after the first few pages when Edmund Foster's life and career with the railways is introduced. And then we are told that Ruth and Lucille, who are the two youngest women in the house and who are entering a phase when they will be under the care of their aunt, Sylvie Foster. The action of the novel, in a way, begins. The thematic plot, in a way, begins with the arrival of Sylvie Foster. The girls, that is Ruth and Lucille, know that their mother Helen had died of suicide. She had driven off a cliff and into a lake. And after that, the girls had been cared for by their grandmother, that is Sylvie Foster. And when their aunt, also named Sylvie, arrives, the girls ask a question which they have been waiting to ask, but they couldn't ask earlier. They ask Sylvie, who's the sister of Helen, and to describe what their mother Helen was like. And this is what Sylvie says. This is on page 51. It's hard to describe someone you know so well. She was very quiet. She played the piano. She collected stamps. Sylvie seemed to be reflecting. I've never known anyone so fond of cats. She was always bringing them home. Now, the reference to collecting stamps, right? This is very important for one scholar, and I think it's important for us as well, because I find the scholarly work that Sarah Wasserman has published to be very persuasive and to be among the most thorough and detailed and very perceptive accounts of American fiction in the 20th century. And as I mentioned in the previous lecture, this book is titled The Death of Things, Ephemera and the American Novel by Sarah Wasserman, published by Minnesota Press in the year 2020. Why is this important? Why is this description important to Wasserman? The first reason why it's important is the reference to Helen's collecting stamps. Now, stamp collection is something that Wasserman tracks across several earlier American novelists. Philip Roth's novel features a very avid stamp collector. Thomas Pynchon's novel, The Crying of Lot 49, also features an important stamp collector. So, stamp collectors in the 20th century American novel for Sarah Wasserman signify the centrality of things, but also specifically the centrality of a specific kind of things to the American novel. In other words, for Sarah Wasserman, the 20th century American novel becomes the powerful, rich, and capacious thing that it is, and the thing that we value it for being today, by describing irrelevant things in a particular way. So what are these things, and how does the 20th century novel describe them? So the things that Wasserman finds most useful to understand this 20th century American novel are things like stamps, but also other pieces of paper which normally individuals do not preserve but frequently discard. Things like tickets to movies, tickets for traveling on buses, trains, receipts for money paid while buying groceries, for eating at a restaurant, or any such very, very ordinary and everyday activity which brings with it and leaves in its wake a small crumb in the form of a paper trail. Now, these things are usually not preserved, but for a lot of protagonists in a few novels, they tend to preserve these things. And this is exactly what we see in Housekeeping as well. Helen and Sylvie, in different ways, preserve things which others would have discarded. So this is important, and I will continue discussing this in the next lecture. Thank you.